You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the London riots. It was the biggest display of civil unrest in Britain for 30 years. 1 year on from the London riots, and more than 3,000 people have been arrested in connection with the unrest, and prison sentences totalling more than 1,800 years have been handed out to the rioters. The disorder began in Tottenham in North London, where locals had been protesting after police shot dead Mark Duggan, a 29-year-old father of 4. From Tottenham, rioting spread across England to cities such as Birmingham, Nottingham and Manchester. Since then, rioters have been handed harsh prison sentences, and the Metropolitan Police have introduced new technology to monitor social media sites, which they say were used to coordinate looting. But have the underlying causes been tackled? Joining me to discuss the lessons learned from the London riots is Keris Cooper, an analyst on the Reading the Riots research project, investigating England's riots. Paul Lewis is Special Projects Editor at the Guardian newspaper, and Rosa Bransky is a former community worker and researcher on the Reading the Riots project. We'll start with you, Keris Cooper, analyst on the Reading the Riots research project. What have you learned about the causes of the riots? Some people pointed to unemployment, others pointed to attitudes towards policing.
I think the main findings that we have are that you can't really talk about the riots as one event that happened. It was really different in all the areas that it took place. There were multiple causes. It's much more complicated than putting it down to people wanting free trainers, people not liking the police. One of the most constant issues were police community relations, but I think that played out slightly differently in all of the areas. And whilst poverty and inequality did come into it as well, I think you can't talk about a single riots that took place, and you can't talk about a typical rioter as well, because a lot of people took part for different reasons.
What were the main categories, would you say, of reasons behind the riots then?
I've already mentioned the police community relations. That was a massive issue, and that was something that was common to all of the areas that interviews took place in, from Salford, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool and various areas of London. Stop and search has been something that's been commented on quite a lot since, and that certainly came up in the interviews. Not just being stopped and searched numerous times, but a lot of the people we spoke to not only got stopped and searched most than the average person, but it was more the manner in which they were stopped and searched, which kind of added to difficult police community relations and their kind of perceptions of how they're treated by the police and other authorities.
Paul Lewis, Special Projects Editor at the Guardian newspaper. What else have we learned about the causes of the riots?
Well, I think Keris is right that we've established that you can't say anything definitively, but whenever you have a bout of civil unrest on that scale, you'll have a kind of confluence of different factors, and it's it might be different each time. You'll always have a trigger, and in the case of the London riots as they were called, but later the England riots as they became, the trigger was the death of Mark Duggan, who was a local man in Tottenham who was shot dead by police. You mentioned him in your introduction. And I think that's interesting from the perspective of history, actually, because if you look at lots of riots over the years, they are often triggered by perceived brutality by the police of one kind or another. That was the case in the 1980s. That was the case, in fact, of the LA riots, when the police officers who were filmed beating Rodney King were later acquitted at court. So I think that that's something we can't let go of. But beyond that, you have the trigger, but the question is, why does it spread? And I think what we kind of, through our research, established that there were a number of factors at play. Keris mentioned police relations, but there was a broader, I think, perceived sense of injustice, and that may have expressed itself in different ways or been experienced in different ways. But it could have been economic for some people, a sense that they didn't have the opportunity to achieve things that other people in society would have. And I think a feeling of detachment as well was also expressed by a considerable number of people who we spoke to as part of this research project. And we can go on about these different factors. In many ways, what's more interesting is the factors that we established were not significant. And to give you two examples, One was gangs. And when I say not significant in the way that it was claimed at the beginning. So both police and the government said to us, or said to the country, that gangs had been instrumental in orchestrating and leading the riots, criminal gangs. And, that claim gradually began to disintegrate as the months went on. And by the time we did our research, we found that some of those gangs, the people who were present during the riots were members of gangs, but the way in which they operated was counterintuitive. So many of the boundaries kind of disintegrated. You had what was in effect a kind of 4-day truce where gangs suspended their hostilities. And this was operating not just in London, but also Birmingham and Manchester and other places. And to give you a second example, social media. Now, it was widely thought at the time that both Facebook and Twitter were really key in the organisation of the riots. And actually we found that was not the case, that neither of those two social networks were particularly significant. Some people were using them, but largely not, because they were public forums. What was used a lot was BlackBerry Messenger. And for your listeners who don't know, that's a private messaging service, an encrypted network that was used by rioters who were reliant upon having a BlackBerry phone, essentially, but similar to Twitter, but closed and private and encrypted. And it was used to share information in advance of disturbances happening.
Rosa Bransky, a former community worker and researcher on the Reading the Riots project, 4 out of 5, every 5 rioters that you guys spoke to said the disorder would happen again. We seem to have learned nothing a year on then.
Absolutely. I think for me the big picture is that we have a significant minority of people in the UK, and significantly young people, that feel as if they're outside of normal society. They're not invested in it, they don't have a stake in it, therefore they don't mind what happens to it. And from my perspective, that's why the riots happened. And I don't think we've changed that, because we haven't found a way to bring them back into society. And
how can we bring them back into society? Is it all about them having more of an investment and feeling more of a part of society?
I think there's a number of issues at play. There's financial, economic issues that need to be dealt with. There's things around housing and new services. I think there's a really interesting question around the media and the way young people engage with the media and the way they feel that they're spoken about by the media. I was working at a homeless hostel for young people during the riots. And there was a really interesting interplay between what was going on on the news and what they were saying. And they felt that they were being talked about for the first time. They'd run into my office and say, look, we're on the news. And they hadn't been anywhere near these riot zones yet. So they were there. They were at the forefront of people's minds for the first time in a long time, if ever. And that made it really clear to me that we need to start talking about them and with them in mainstream society and in public, and that is one of the ways we include them.
You say we need to. We're a year on now. This is quite shocking, Keris. Rosa just saying we've learned nothing a year on. Have we really learned nothing?
I think there are lots of lessons to be learnt. There's been a lot of research into it, but I don't think enough of it's actually been acted on yet. And going back to Rosa's point about young people and how they're portrayed in the media, I think that's actually something that was made worse by the riots. A lot of young people were demonised, and rioters were spoken about as if they were young people, and it was just young people, when we know that that wasn't the case from people that have been arrested and from people that we've spoken to in our interviews. So I think I think the demonisation of young people is actually something that's been made much worse by the riots, and something that needs to be, how young people are portrayed and spoken about is something that really needs to be tackled if we're going to make them feel more included in society, rather than marginalised, which is how a lot of people described feeling. A lot of people that took part or observed, and knew people that took part, described really feeling quite detached from mainstream society, and from what was going on in the rest of society, and from the media, and from powerful authorities that, kind of discussed in the immediate aftermath of, this was criminality, this was why it happened, people just, looting for free stuff.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the London riots. Joining me is Keris Cooper, an analyst on the Reading the Riots research project investigating England's riots. Paul Lewis is special projects editor at the Guardian newspaper, and Rosa Bransky is a researcher on the Reading the Riots project. This is quite shocking, Paul. I read this morning David Starkey, the famous historian, saying the government read the March report on the riots and they put it away because it was too difficult to deal with. We're a year on and there's still lessons to be learned. And Rose is concerned that we've learned nothing.
I think what Rosa was saying, and she's right in saying this, is that we have learnt something, but not very much has been done about it. And again, if you look to history, it's very common for bouts of civil unrest to be followed by further bouts of civil unrest. So it's quite likely it's going to happen. And we interviewed 270 rioters and 130 police officers. And on most things, as you would imagine, they profoundly disagreed with each other. The one area where there was some degree of agreement was on the likelihood of a repeat of the riots. Now, both rioters and police said they thought the riots would happen again. Probably the reason they said that is because the conditions that existed a year ago have either not changed or not got better, if you like, or actually they've deteriorated. Certainly, if you look at the broader economic outlook, they've deteriorated. And to the extent to which things like cuts to youth services or a sense of alienation or high levels of unemployment, that's a question, but the extent to which those cause or lead to riots, well, they've all got worse too.
So what should we be looking at? We've discussed some of the problems, some of the causes of the riots, but now we'll start looking at the things that need to be dealt with. Boris Johnson this morning, the London mayor, saying there are still deep social problems that need to be dealt with. What is it that the government needs to do instantly tomorrow? Do they need to be ploughing money into youth services?
Well, I think that would help. I mean, I think, whilst it's true that it's not the case that the riots were singularly caused or executed, if you like, by young people, it's also true that most of the people involved were young people, and that's broadly the demographic of those who were taking part, particularly in London. And I think you need to look at that category of people because, you have about 25% unemployment among under 24s who are not in education. And I think you have a general sense among that generation that they've lost the opportunities that were available to generations before them. And I think employment could be key. I mean, after we ran our research project, I thought one of the more sensible contributions and reflections on our research came from the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said, essentially, that what was key to stopping this from happening again was giving people a stake in society or giving them a stake in their own lives, a reason or something to lose. Many of these people, he argued, had nothing to lose, and a job is key for that. It isn't an academic finding, but one of the observations that emerged from our research, from our interviews, that really struck me were interviews with people who had looted, places like JB Sports, for example. And they told us that before, in the weeks and months before they looted that shop, they'd applied for a job in the very same shop. And there's something kind of significant and symbolic about that, if you just think about it for a second, because these are people who wanted work and who tried to apply for work in those places and didn't get them. Now, I'm not saying that what they did subsequently was an act of protest. I think it would be a controversial thing to say. And absolutely we found that opportunism was key to all of this. People were frank with us about how they saw this as an opportunity to acquire free stuff when law was suspended. But you cannot completely discount that broader kind of political backdrop to what was happening.
Rosa Bransky, Karen McCluskey, a Glasgow-based government advisor, said that the reason why there weren't any riots in Scotland was because Scots didn't aspire to greed. Was this all just about people trying to get something for nothing?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I spoke to a number of people that had been in the riots that were quite clear about the fact that they wanted things. I also spoke to people that had no interest in going into shops. They were there very much to have confrontation with police. There were other people that kind of swept up in the feeling of it. So I don't think the one reason was to acquire things, but certainly that played a role.
Apart from employment, how can we give people a bigger stake in society that Paul was speaking about?
I think what worries me sometimes is that we spend a lot of time talking about youth services as this kind of singular thing, and people get this idea that if you invest a certain number of £1 million into new youth centres and football pitches, then everything would be okay. I think one of the problems in this country is that we don't look at services for young people or vulnerable people as a whole in a joined up way. So certainly young people need places and spaces in which to spend their time in a safe way. They also need safe places to live. They need enough money to live and eat, and that they need access to education. And until we look at those services as a package of provision that together make some sort of difference to people's lives, things won't move on. So I think the singular focus on youth services is for me a little bit of a distraction.
You've actually worked in youth services, you've been a community worker, but what do you think really needs to be done to help the people that you used to work with?
So we've got social service departments, housing departments, and youth services shutting down all over the country. So I think the least we should be doing at the moment is not making things worse. And as Paul pointed out, in many, many places, things have become worse since the riots, not better. So I don't know how we can expect any other outcome but for them to happen again.
Karis Cooper?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, cuts actually to youth services, youth centres, also to financial support to education was something that was spoken about by a lot of people that we interviewed. And not just young people, older people would talk about how they used to have youth clubs that they were able to go to and to keep them off the streets, and so they could actually feel a part of something and enjoy themselves and do something productive. And how in recent years, you've just seen youth centre after youth centre be closed down. So how to make things better when funding's being pulled out of these things for young people is really difficult. In fact, there was one quote which kind of springs to mind at this point, with one of the interviewees has actually said in an interview, you know, if you're taking away our youth centres, what do you expect us to do? We'll go and create our own youth centre on the road and we'll create more mischief. And, you know, I'm not saying that if you shut youth centres, young people are automatically going to go and commit crime, but if there's nothing for people to take part in, there's nothing for them to do when they get home from school, and at the same time they're seeing cuts to financial support for education, both to go into sixth form college and also university fees was something else that was really, you know, a lot of people were very upset about and quite angry about whether or not they were intending to go to university. The fact that the fees are going to be tripled and that just puts it out of a lot of people's reach was just another way that they saw things as being made much more unfair, much less opportunity for young people, much less for them to do.
Some people might say to you, well, the government has got to make austerity cuts. The government has to cut back on public spending. What else do you expect them to do? That everyone's got to take a cut?
Yeah, there do have to be cuts that are made, and a lot of people we spoke to were aware of that as well. But I think how you make those cuts, where you choose to make those cuts, is really important. I'm not an expert on how those cuts should be made, but you know, we've had the riots. There are clearly a number of issues that need to be addressed. As we've said, it wasn't just one thing, but this took place against a backdrop of increasing cuts, lack of jobs, high youth unemployment, difficulty getting into education. And I think really you need to think about what's going to be prioritised. If we're going to have to cut things, is this the way forward? Education and youth services, where there's actually no jobs for young people as well.
Paul, how can we minimise the chances of this happening again?
There's a number of things you could do. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that in some senses, you will all be a hostage to fortune, really, because, you know, riots can pop out of nowhere and they can happen at any time. And actually, sometimes they're really unexpected, although in this case, I think there were quite a few people saying that it was a possibility coming down the road. I mean, one question that we've not addressed yet is policing. And I think it's fair to say that there were some pretty significant failings in the policing approach to the riots. I mean, there were also some incredible acts of heroism and bravery. But if you look at London specifically, the big tactical failing was the mobilisation of resources. So the riots began on a Saturday night. They continued to spread on a Sunday night. And then again, by the third night, a Monday night, we had the biggest bout of civil unrest ever seen in the capital, probably in history, modern history anyway. So you had, you know, by the third night, I think 26 out of 32 boroughs had civil disorder in them. And yet the Metropolitan Police, which obviously has responsibility for policing the capital, hadn't used a mutual aid system to bring in police officers from counties outside of London to full effect. So we only had a relatively small number of officers from outside London in London. Most of them came on the Tuesday by the time the riots had happened. In fact, that massive increase in police officers may account to why some of the disorder in London stopped by that fourth night. Of course, it was continuing elsewhere in the country. So I think there's a real question there for police about how do they quickly and efficiently get sufficiently large numbers of boots on the ground when something like this is happening. And they were constantly playing catch-up.
Could that not make things worse, though, having a large amount of police? Does it not antagonise the situation?
No, I mean...
They go in too quickly is my question.
I understand that argument. I'm not sure it's correct. I think when you have a large riot, you want large numbers of police officers there. The question is how they operate. And when you say antagonising, then I think, an instantly heavy-handed approach can be antagonising, can inflame a situation. But that isn't what we had in London at that time. It's not that we had some large crowds gathering and there was no question as to whether or not there was going to be disorder. We had, fires and looting systematically spreading across the capital, and it needed to be desperately contained. So that's a crucial aspect that I think will probably be changed in the future. But even if police adopt a whole array of different tactics, and we know, for example, that they've now invested in a lot more rubber bullets, they're considering bringing water cannon into the country for the first time on the mainland, and they will certainly rethink the way in which they mobilise resources from outside of the capital and how they monitor social media as well. But even if they do all of those things, it isn't clear that any police force, non-military police force, civilian police force, could ever cope with a bout of unrest spreading with the speed and on the scale of what we saw last year.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Joining me is Keris Cooper, an analyst on the Reading the Riots research project investigating England's riots. Paul Lewis is special projects editor at the Guardian newspaper, and Rosa Bransky is a former community worker and now researcher on the Reading the Riots project. Rosa, if we bring you in here, what else can we learn to minimise the chances of this happening again? We've heard from people that have spoken to you on the Reading the Riots project that they think it's going to happen again.
There's a certain set of conditions that lead to rioting, and if those conditions change or deteriorate, then rioting inevitably will happen again at some point. So we've looked at police community relations, particularly stop search. That was a massive issue for the people we spoke to. So something needs to be done there. Some work needs to be done, looking at the way that people, and young people in particular, and the police communicate with each other.
What would you like to see change with stop and search?
What's really interesting is that the way young people think that they're being spoken to by people in positions of authority, and it's not actually just police, it's social service departments, it's job centres, it's anywhere where they come into people who are in perceived positions of authority, and they're not afforded the respect they think they deserve. And respect is a massive issue amongst young people, particularly in London, I think. So the way people talk to each other on a very basic level needs to shift in some way. That's where a lot of animosity came from. As we've talked about, youth services, youth centres, access to housing, access to affordable education and employment. I think what we found was very similar to what was found in the 80s and what has been found before that. People need to have their basic needs met. So that's their housing, affordable food, access to some form of entertainment and employment. Those are the things that people need to be happy and to be invested in society. And when people are invested in society, they don't smash society up.
Keris Cooper, you're in charge of government policy right now. What on earth would you do to change and minimise the chances of these riots repeating?
The number of main areas we've already discussed are obviously policing. That's already being looked into, and that's something that was one of the first things to be flagged up. So stop and search, but also how police communicate with the community, how they interact with them, how they might be given some warning if something like this was to happen again, if they had representatives in the community that they can speak to. And I think there is work being done in that area. We've also spoken about youth services. Obviously that's funding dependent, but I would say that's quite a big priority. Youth services, jobs for young people, even if it's, even if you're ploughing a bunch of money into it now to invest in people. I think that would really pay off to get the youth unemployment figures down, affordable education. But also looking at wider society, something else that was spoken about with a lot of anger from people we spoke to was the kind of examples they see set by other elites, such as MPs with expense scandals, bankers who have received large bonuses despite us being in an economic recession. So I think really, rather than just looking at this, significant minority of the population, I think we need to evaluate how everything is being run at the moment, and how the kinds of rules that apply to other people, the kinds of sanctions that are applied to people for when they misbehave, versus the kinds of sentences that people got for stealing pairs of trainers in the riots.
Paul Lewis, you analysed 2.6 million tweets. How significant was social media in all of this?
Well, social media was significant in the sense that for many people in society, the way in which they were understanding the riots was, as they were happening, through a lens of social media. It was just an amazing reporting tool, and it was very useful for people who wanted to find out what was happening around them. There was also a lot of rumour that was spread via social media, and particularly here we're talking about Twitter. So one of the things we did with that database was analyse it, and analyse with a view to looking at how rumours were disseminated through the Twitter sphere, if you like, but then more interestingly, how they kind of came to an end. And we found that the kind of Twitter had this kind of self-regulating capacity. There were all sorts of interesting rumours that were flying around at the time, from the London Eye being on fire. There was a mock-up picture, in fact, of the London Eye on flames, even though it's constructed of steel. But that would start to spin around the Twitter sphere, as you can imagine, and then gradually come to an end. Another one that, interestingly for your listeners, came from Russia was the suggestion that London Zoo had been broken into. And once that rumour began flying around, you had people attempting to kind of propagate it with hoaxes. So people were taking pictures of penguins and superimposing them on London streets, and then there was a puma and then some monkeys running around Regent's Park. So these rumours were flying, but what's really interesting is, quite independently of the types of traditional authorities or gatekeepers like the media, what was bringing them to an end was actually kind of people generally who saw that these were untrue and were very quick to correct them.
As we come to the end of this discussion, I just wanted to grab a picture from all three of you. One of the victims of the riots, as well as many others, have said that they fear more civil unrest again in the future. Will it happen again, Keris?
I think, judging by interviews with people that took part, as well as police officers, I'd say there's every chance that it will happen again. When it will happen and what will be the trigger is something that we don't really know, but there's certainly still the same kind of conditions for it to take place.
Rosa Bransky?
Yes, I'd say absolutely they'll happen again.
And finally, Paul Lewis?
Well, it could be, it may not be. It's very difficult to know. I mean, in some ways we have conditions which are right, but so do many other countries. But I think we have not really fully recovered from the damage that has been done to some of these communities, and that's one of the key questions. You mentioned victims and you mentioned communities, and it's one of the saddest things of all of this, that probably the group that has been most neglected and feels most abandoned a year on from the riots are the people who suffered the most when it happened.
Well, on that note, we will leave today's discussion. Thank you to all of my guests: Keris Cooper, an analyst on the Reading the Riots project, Paul Lewis, special projects editor at the Guardian newspaper, and Rosa Bransky, a researcher on the Reading the Riots project. Where locals have been protesting after police shot dead Mark Duggan, a 29-year-old father of four. From Tottenham, rioting spread across England to cities such as Birmingham, Nottingham and Manchester. Since then, rioters have been handed harsh prison sentences, and the Metropolitan Police have introduced new technology to monitor social media sites, which they say were used to coordinate looting. But have the underlying causes been tackled? Joining me to discuss the lessons learned from the London riots is Keris Cooper, an analyst on the Reading the Riots research project, investigating England's riots. Paul Lewis is special projects editor at the Guardian newspaper, and Rosa Bransky is a former community worker and researcher on the Reading the Riots project. We'll start with you, Keris Cooper, analyst on the Reading the Riots research project. What have you learned about the causes of the riots? Some people pointed to unemployment, others pointed to attitudes towards policing.
I think the main findings that we have are that you can't really talk about the riots as one event that happened. It was really different in all the areas that it took place. There were multiple causes. It's much more complicated than putting it down to people wanting free trainers, people not areas of London. Stop and search has been something that's been commented on quite a lot since, and that certainly came up in the interviews. Not just being stopped and searched numerous times, but a lot of the people we spoke to not only got stopped and searched most than the average person, but it was more the manner in which they were stopped and searched, which kind of added to difficult police community relations and their kind of perceptions of how they're treated by the police and other authorities.
Paul Lewis, special projects editor at the Guardian newspaper. What else have we learned about the causes of the riots?
Well,
liking the police. One of the most constant issues were police community relations, but I think that played out slightly differently in all of the areas. And whilst poverty and inequality did come into it as well, I think you can't talk about a single riots that took place, and you can't talk about a typical rioter as well, because a lot of people took part for different reasons.
What were the main categories, would you say, of reasons behind the riots then?
I've already mentioned the police community relations. That was a massive issue, and that was something that was common to all of the areas that interviews took place in, from Salford, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and various.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the London riots. It was the biggest display of civil unrest in Britain for 30 years. 1 year on from the London riots, and more than 3,000 people have been arrested in connection with the unrest, and prison sentences totalling more than 1,800 years have been handed out to the rioters. The disorder began in Tottenham in North London.